evening, folks. Thanks for coming out. A couple announcements before we get going. My name is Hoppy Kercheval. I'll be your host this evening. So again, we appreciate you being here for an evening with Michael Tomasky, and just a couple of things before we get started. Thanks to the Reed School of Media for hosting the event this evening in this beautiful building, and Dean Marianne Reed. Where's Marianne? Thank you, Marianne. Thank you very much. The format is I'll introduce Michael. He'll talk about his book for about 10 or 15 minutes. I have some questions, and then we'll open up for your questions. There will be, just raise your hand when you have questions at the for the last third. We'll kind of divide up in thirds. And there'll be a interviewer who'll come around with the mic. We want to record this tonight, so we want to get the questions on tape. So that'll come up later. So let's get started.
Wait for the microphone.
Wait, let me introduce you.
Okay.
What were we going to say?
Wait for the microphone and don't give a speech. Ask a question, okay? That's something you have to say to New York audiences. I'm not sure we have to
West
say
Virginia.
it to
You don't have to say that here. We know that. If we can keep it, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved by Michael Tomasky. Michael, as most of you know, is a Morgantown, West Virginia native. Parents both from here. His father was a well-known attorney in Morgantown for many years. Michael graduated from WVU, what was then the J School back in the day. He went to New York University and studied political science there. He's now based in the Washington, D.C. area. He's a columnist for the Daily Beast, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He has a piece in today, in fact. A contributor to the New York Review of Books, editor of Democracy, a journal of ideas. His other books include Hillary's Turn, Inside Her Improbable Victoria Senate Campaign, which was published in 2001, and Left for Dead, The Life, Death, and Possible Resurrection of Progressive Politics in West Virginia, in America. Michael's a frequent guest on cable news shows and on MetroNews Talkline. His new book is being acclaimed as an honest, insightful look at not only why our politics are so polarized, but how we got here and what might be done to change it. The New York Times Review described the book as a sweeping, rollicking, sometimes breezy political and cultural backstory to our current moment, one that demands we become informed, among other things, about the Connecticut Compromise, the career of Martin Van Buren, and the Supreme Court decision in the Marquette National Bank case. And only Michael could make those things interesting. Added up, and Tomasky hopes to answer a fundamental question: how our system became so broken as to elect someone like Donald Trump. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Tomasky.
Thanks, Hoppy. I'm going to stand.
Oh, go ahead, sure.
Great start. Thank you. Marianne, thank you. Thanks to the College of Media, what I used to call the J School, my alma mater. This is a magnificent place that they have here. I would imagine this is the first time some of you have seen it, but it represents what she has done here as dean with this school. It's really, she does a magnificent job. Okay, so 10 minutes. I have like a 20-minute wrap. Last week in Charlottesville, I did a 15-minute wrap, so today I'll try a 10-minute one, and I'll do my very best. What's this book about? Well, it's about political polarization. We all know what that is. We all watch it every day. It gets worse every week, right? I mean, it literally these days gets worse every week of our lives. It's not new. We'll get to that in a second. But I say that the severity of it and the quality of it is a new thing in American history. I'll explain why. But it's something that we all worry about, whatever side of the spectrum we're on and whichever side we tend to blame. It's something that upsets us all, and rightly so, because we're going down a hole. I have, at previous speeches, been criticized by my host and moderator for not having much positive to say and not being able to leave people on an optimistic note, and I'll cop to that. I try in the last chapter, but we're stuck. We're in a rough place. I won't sugarcoat that. I have some ideas for how things might get better, but it's not going to happen overnight. Okay, so let me describe the problem as I see it and the problem that I wanted to describe in this book. I've read a lot of books on this topic, a lot of really good books, but a lot of them kind of go back not that far in American history. They kind of go back to the 90s, you know, Gingrich and Clinton's and all of that stuff, which is really when the modern problem sort of started. But it's really deeper than that. It's true the problem goes back to the 90s, the 1790s. Yeah, that's a laugh line. Everybody's laughing. They really liked that last week in Charlottesville. And it is true that when you go back, as I did while researching this book, and read about the fights in those days, they are almost word for word, if you modernize the language a little bit, like the fights we have today. And the central thing that people fought about was the size and scope and power of the federal government. And in those days, you had on the one side the Hamiltonians. The Hamiltonians were the big government people. They were the city slickers. They were the coastal elites. They were the swells. Went to the better universities, all that kind of stuff. Isn't that just like today? They wanted the big government. On the other side were the Jeffersonians. They were, well, the phrase was the yeoman farmers. The Jeffersonians were the yeoman farmers, the backwoodsmen, the frontiersmen, who distrusted big, powerful federal government. Exactly the same as today. Nothing has changed. We've added more things to fight about these days, and we fight about a lot more things than that, but that core argument has remained the same from the beginning of the Republic. But here's another point. Here's what has changed. And here's what I think is important and worrying about the situation that we're in today. And I have to explain this by talking about the history of our political parties in this country. So we have two political parties, two dominant political parties. We really always have from the beginning of the Republic. They weren't always the Democrats and the Republicans. In the early days, they were the Federalists versus people who were perhaps confusingly by today's standards called the Democratic Republicans. And then after that collapsed, you had the Democrats versus the Whigs. You all remember the Whigs. Go Whigs. They were around from the 1830s to the 1850s. And then in the 1850s, it became the Democrats and Republicans. So we always had a two-party system, but here's the thing, and this is like the important point that I want readers and you to kind of understand. For most of our history, we had inter-party polarization between the two parties, but we also had a lot of intra-party polarization within the party, okay? So we had inter-party and intra-party polarization. Our parties, in other words, were not ever really ideologically coherent political parties, okay? Now, I have a whole lot in the book on that. Chapter 2 is the main chapter where I go through that. It's the longest chapter in the book. It covers a lot of history from 1790 up through 1930. And so just read the chapter if you want to get the full story, but just quickly here, for a few reasons, notable among them, the slavery question, which our politicians sought to put off. They didn't really want to have to deal with it in the early days of the Republic. And because of the way the country grew and changed, and the way it added population and added states, and the very identity of the country kept changing over the course of the 19th century. So for those two main reasons, our parties were not ideologically coherent parties, okay? Now in Europe, they had ideologically coherent parties. Like in England, there was a liberal party and a conservative party, very clearly labeled. You couldn't miss it. The liberals versus the conservatives. There's a Labour Party in England now, of course, but they came along later in the 20th century. France had also, by different name, a liberal party and a conservative party. Germany, same thing. The United States, we didn't really have that. Now, the Democrats are the liberal party and basically became that under Roosevelt. But remember, even up to Roosevelt's time, the Democrats had the Southern segregationists, very conservative. And the Republicans were basically a conservative party, basically the party of Wall Street. But they had a lot of liberals, too, a lot of moderates and a lot of liberals. New Englanders were Republicans, going back even up into our lifetimes, And this leads to my favorite political trivia question of all time. If anybody here gets this, I'll be really impressed. There's a sitting senator right now, okay? Sitting senator right now, who's the first Democrat ever elected from his state. What state? Now you're thinking like out west, right? You're thinking Rocky Mountains. Yeah. Vermont. Pat Leahy was elected in the 70s. First Democrat ever elected from Vermont. Vermont elected Republicans. It was a liberal Republican state. That's how different our parties were, okay? That gives you a pretty good sense of how our parties were these ideological grab bags. Democrats basically liberal, Republicans basically conservative, but tons of overlap. Now that overlap was a really good thing, because that overlap meant in Washington that these people could actually like talk to each other and compromise and cooperate. So when we were kids, there's a general demographic that applies to this room. When we were kids, there were, the Democrats went from here to here, and the Republicans went from here to here. There was a lot of space in the middle, right? The most conservative Democrat and the most conservative or most liberal Republican, there were 15 people in the middle there in the United States Senate. That meant they could compromise. That's when polarization, that's the only period in this country's history when polarization was pretty reduced. In the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s, even maybe you could say into the 80s a little bit. What has happened since then, really since the 60s with civil rights and race, and then with women's rights, and then with immigration, and also with the changing economic fortunes of the country, the inflation of the 1970s, deindustrialization, all these pressures and tensions that had never existed before, the parties began to split, and the parties began to become ideologically coherent. Until you get to our time, I have one more minute. Until you get to our time, no more overlap. No more overlap, you see. So all this overlap that existed from the 40s, 30s and 40s up through the 70s and 80s just kind of went like that. And so it's not there anymore. So there's no room for compromise anymore. Now, I happen to think, and we might argue about this, that one of our parties has kind of gone like that, while the other one has kind of gone like that. But whatever you think about that, the fundamental problem I've described to you is one I think that we can all basically agree on. That we don't have this overlap anymore, and we don't have it for a good and unavoidable reason. There are really serious issues that we disagree very strongly on. So that's what's happened. It's not, it's not a new thing. It's a thing that was many, many, many years in the making. And it's going to take many, many years to fix. I guess we'll talk about some of my proposed solutions at some point. But in a nutshell, that's the story that the book tries to tell, and tries to tell, I hope, in a readable, accessible way. Thank you.
Michael, one of the great sections of the book is the age of consensus from 1945 to the 1980s, and we'll talk about that. Were there other ages of consensus in the country's history that are equal to that?
Just one, brief one. You may remember the phrase from school, the era of good feelings. It was 1815 to 1824. So 9 years, didn't last very long. What they meant by the era of good feelings is that competition between the parties I mentioned first, the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists faded away after the War of 1812, actually. The Federalists had opposed the War of 1812, and that was a popular position in 1812, but it was an unpopular position by 1814 when we almost kind of sort of won the war, or when Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans.
Michael, why wouldn't the founding of the country be an age of a period of consensus when the founders agreed on the principles that we still subscribe to today?
Because they were split over slavery. They were split over questions about how much power the federal government would have. And the first big debate in Congress was over the creation of a national bank. And the Hamiltonians were for it, and the Jeffersonians were against it. So there were a lot of things like that. But actually, you know, if you go back, and this is another point I make in the book, go back to the Constitutional Convention, the summer of 1787, when they wrote this document. And the way we're taught about that in school is that these geniuses did this genius thing. And you know, in many ways they were geniuses, and in many ways it was a genius thing. But it was a political thing. They really disagreed. They fought and fought and fought. And it almost fell apart. And they made compromises that they all hated. So the existence of the United States Senate, which was the Connecticut Compromise, which Hoppy mentioned, that passed 5 to 4 to 1. Each state delegation had a vote at the Constitutional Convention. There were 55 delegates from 13 states, obviously, or maybe only 12. And each state had a vote. The Senate passed 5 to 4 to 1. The big states, woke up the next morning and said, what the hell had just happened? What are we going to do here? We can't let this stand. This is insane. But they couldn't agree on a plan B, so they just kind of dropped it.
You're not going to get out of here without a thrilling Martin Van Buren story.
Yeah.
So please tell.
Yeah, sure. Martin Van Buren is a lot more important than you think. So you know him as this president who's just somewhere before Lincoln, that indistinguished run of people before Lincoln, and you know that he had those big sideburns that went out like this. And he was a bad president. He was a one-term, he followed Andrew Jackson. He was a one-term president, bad economy. He couldn't do anything with the economy, and he didn't even win re-election. But other than his presidency, he was an extremely important and influential figure in American politics. He really is the person who created the Democratic Party. You know, the Democratic Party's dinners today are called Jefferson-Jackson dinners. They should be called Van Buren dinners. I don't understand why they're not. Maybe because he had those big, weird sideburns. But, you know, he was a Secretary of State, a Vice President, a Senator, very important figure, very influential figure, very, very polished, genteel, you know, well-spoken kind of guy. I write in the book, he's the kind of senator that if he were alive today, he'd be on Morning Joe twice a week. You know, he's got that kind of like panache about him. Very important figure who I tried to, you know, elevate his historical profile. I hope the people at the Van Buren Historical Society have bought 50 copies of this book.
One of the fascinating parts, well, the book is fascinating, but one of the really compelling parts is the age of consensus, which I said 45 to the early 1980s. You touched on it there, but it requires a larger explanation by you as to how it arrived and the stories behind that and what it meant.
Well, two things, the Depression and the war. A lot of us are children of parents who lived through the Depression and the war, so we know this from our parents and we know this from stories. And their stories, you multiply them by millions. And this was a true thing. People lived through shared sacrifice in those days and shared privation of a sort that we just don't have now. So in 1935 in this country, the average household income was around $1,500. Adjust that for inflation to today's money, and it's about $28,000 average. Now, does anybody know what the poverty level for a family of four is today in the United States? It's like 25,000. So in other words, the average family was just above poverty by today's standards. People went through a lot together, and they helped each other, and it created a sense of social solidarity that we no longer have. The war, even more so. And I have a long section in the book about, for example, the rationing that took place during the war. And, you know, women couldn't buy nylons until about 1947. But things more important than that, you know, rubber, because Japan had occupied most of the countries where the rubber came from. So And what rubber we had access to was needed for the war, for airplanes, for jeeps, for tanks. All of this sacrifice, shared sacrifice, brought the country together. And beyond that, and we were talking about this earlier, the men, and in those days it was all men, who would go on to serve in Congress, they all fought in the war. Every one of them. Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, they all fought in the war. George McGovern, the biggest, the most liberal presidential candidate of all time, one of the greatest fighter pilot heroes of the Second World War. But conservatives and liberals, they stormed Utah Beach, they liberated Buchenwald, they fought in Okinawa, and I quote another book in my book saying that when you've done that, you have a pretty good sense of what an enemy is. And you don't look across the aisle and think of that person as an enemy. It was a different time. And, they were reminded of it daily. Bob Dole, Republican, and Daniel Inouye, Democrat of Hawaii, both injured in northern Italy in a similar fashion, grenade accidents. Also within about 30 miles of each other and within a few days of each other, I think. Convalesced in the same hospital with a third senator, Philip Hart of Michigan. And Inouye and Dole got to the Senate, I think, within a year of each other. Inouye first, and Dole first and Inouye second. But right around the same time. So they're walking around with their arms that they can't use, and their colleagues see this every day. I mean, it was a very different time in a very different country, and it made people realize that they had to work together for something. They had something to preserve.
In the subsequent chapter, Michael, you start to talk about how things began to come apart. You put a lot of blame on Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. Why?
Well, I do think Gingrich was the most divisive figure of the era, and you teed me up to quote him, which I quote in the book. In contrast to these guys who fought in the actual war, Gingrich was interviewed by a journalist in the early 90s about why he didn't go to Vietnam. And he said, given everything I believe, I probably should have gone, but there was a bigger war going on in Congress. So I mean, that tells you about how the mindset changed as one generation faded away and another generation took over. Everything that has happened is not the fault of the Republican Party by any stretch of the imagination. But Gingrich led a sort of movement to upset the establishment of a sort that was new in American politics, and in the intervening years has really taken over the Republican Party.
A couple more questions from me, and then we'll get to questions from you all. One of the more fascinating chapters is Chapter 5, and it's called, well, you have a couple of subtitles there, and I thought it was a kind of a curveball in your book. More Consumers Than Citizens, How the Search for Credit and Yield Changed Us as Human Beings. Why was that bad?
Well, some of it was good. It made us wealthier. It made us better off. It added more wealth to the country and to the average household. But there were some negative social effects. So this chapter, which is different, I'm glad you think. I mean, it's not the kind of chapter that's usually included in this kind of book. It's more about economics than it is about politics or social issues. It starts with a discussion of the inflation of the 1970s, which most of you here will remember. And, it was horrible. It was horrible. The Fed wants inflation to be 2% at most these days, right? Inflation in those years, I quote the numbers in the book, 7%, 9%, 8%, 11%. It was punishing, absolutely punishing. It, too, changed us in a certain way, I think. But in an opposite way from the Depression. The Depression made people more looking out for each other, made people more like their neighbor's keeper. The inflation made people more look out for themselves because they were falling behind. The average person, the average household was falling behind. It made people a little more selfish, frankly. And then came the great economic changes of the 80s and the Wall Street titans and the masters of the universe and the mega deals and the growth of this, the explosion in compensation and the explosion in ball players' salaries and movie stars' salaries and Wall Street compensation and all that sort of thing. It just really changed the country. And Hoppy, I think that it did something to our civic life. It dented somehow.
How so?
The civic culture. Well, it made us more acquisitive. It made us all think more about status, made us all think more about money, made us think less about civic affairs, made us think less about the common good and more about, should I get an $800 dishwasher or a $1,400 dishwasher? I want that $1,400 dishwasher, and why shouldn't I have it? And, and now, we're at a point where, I'm taking my daughter to New York in a few weeks, and I was just looking it up. I'm going to take her to the Empire State Building. So, of course, as with anywhere, I was looking at ticket prices. You can buy the tickets where, you get to pass the line. And they're twice as much. They're like $80 as opposed to $40. Now, of course, I'm going to do it because, who wants to stand in that line? And I happen to be able to afford it. But, these things, that's a little manifestation. But these things create more and more and more and more divisions in society.
I really thought you'd be more egalitarian and stand in the line. But
well, I busted myself, okay?
There's a lot of discussion about political will and the suggestion that we can't get things done or compromise because there's not political will. You wholesale dismiss this concept of political will.
Yeah, it's not like you hear this on cable TV. Why can't these people just get together and work things out? And it's just not that simple, folks. It just isn't that simple. These historical forces are pressing on people. I have no doubt that, Nancy Pelosi and, well, he's not there anymore, but Paul Ryan, I write in the book, I have no doubt that Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan would like to agree more. They're both perfectly nice people. They don't, they're not really, either of them, an extremist. I'm sure they'd like to shake hands and make a deal. But there are pressures that weigh on them, and they just can't do it. They can't do it. And I do think that more of these pressures are on the Republican side, and I'll give one example, which I talk about in the book, which is Grover Norquist and the tax pledge that he's made Republicans take. And I think it's been very destructive to the country. So this happened in 1990 after George Bush Sr. raised taxes against his word, and ever since, with a couple of minor, asterisk exceptions, not a single Republican in Congress has voted for a tax increase for any purpose since 1990. Now that can't be, that just can't be. We have new needs that arise. You don't have to love taxes to agree that needs arise, and sometimes they need to be paid. I'm sure this building was partly built with federal money. Do you know the answer? Yeah. Well, partly, but you just look out this window. In the Health Sciences Center, half this town probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for that stuff related to the university. So, but the fact that they won't talk at all about a tax increase has really made it difficult. And Norquist will acknowledge this, by the way. He proudly acknowledges that his tax pledge has helped polarize the country.
You end the book with a chapter of 14 things that you think can or should be done to try to save the Republic. I won't go through all 14. You can mention some of your favorites. One that really stands out is, and this probably will get a groan, but make the House of Representatives larger. More politicians. Why?
Well, two reasons. First of all, the size of it hasn't been increased since 1910, when the population of the country was 90 million people. And at that time, each member of Congress represented about 270,000 people. Now each member of Congress represents about 750,000 people. there's a lot of democratic, small d democratic theory that says that's just too big, that's too unwieldy, that's unrepresentative. If you look at countries that similarly to us have single-member district representation, like the United Kingdom, each member of parliament in England represents about 120,000 people. And we can't go that small, but there's a strong argument rooted in political philosophy going back to Montesquieu, that who the founders read very avidly, that districts should be smaller than that, and representatives should be closer to people. The other reason, and this is too complicated to go into in detail, you'll just have to read it in the book, but I think that there are other ways of electing members of Congress besides the way we do. Other countries do other things, and I talk about those in the book. And I think we should adopt some of those systems and have kind of a mixed system, because it might produce more moderate representatives of both parties.
Regional exchange students.
I was thinking about the fact that, in a lot of ways, we don't know each other in this country anymore, and I'm sure you've all read stories. Blue people cluster together in blue places. Red people cluster together in red places. Morgantown's an unusual, mixed place in a red sea, but university towns smaller university towns tend to be like that. They tend to be the only exceptions, but usually blue, solid red, and we don't know each other anymore. So I was just thinking, well, we started these foreign exchange programs after World War II to get to know other cultures from around the world. Why not have a foreign exchange program here, so that students from West Virginia University may go spend a year at Lehman College in the Bronx, and kids from the Bronx come down here and spend a year, or not even here, because this is kind of cosmopolitan, actually, by West Virginia standards, maybe, down at the southern part of the state somewhere. Anyway, that's the idea. There's a few solutions in the book, a few proposals in the book that aren't necessarily about Washington or about politics at all, but that say, let's do these kinds of social exchange programs where we can kind of get to know each other again and maybe hate each other a little less.
Expand civics education.
I feel strongly about that one. Most students, I interviewed a few experts on civics education, and they lament terribly the condition of it and say that most kids get a year or two of civics education. And I think this is part of the problem too. I think we need, I think there should be 12 years of civics education. I quote some reports in the book that talk about the kinds of things that civics education ought to cover. I think it's vitally important. I think it's something that Democrats and Republicans can actually agree on. They may disagree on what the actual specific content of the civics education is, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be taught the same way in Alabama as it does in Vermont. Just teach it.
Finally, then we'll get your questions ready. We'll go to the questions next. Demand more business and corporate responsibility.
Yeah, so there was a time, and it's the same old time that I return to, the 50s, the 60s, and everything wasn't perfect back then, by the way, and I make this clear in the book too, okay? Like if you were a black person or a gay person, things were really not terribly close to perfect. But it was an age where the political system functioned in a better way. And one of the reasons the political system functioned in a better way did have to do with the way corporate America conceived of its interests within the state and within the broader social and civic community. There was an organization called the Council for Economic Development, which was a business council, which was specifically committed to the idea of making corporations make money, of course, it's their first job, and nobody begrudges that, but also to be citizens of their community, of their state, and of their country. That got wiped away largely through the efforts of Milton Friedman and the people at the University of Chicago Economics Department, who said, starting in the 1960s and then into the 70s, and it really took hold in the 80s, that a corporation's only responsibility is to maximize profit. Now, if you follow this kind of news closely, you'll know that there's a lot of debate about this right now, and there probably will be in the next presidential campaign. And there are many movements afoot to change what is called sometimes shareholder primacy, and try to make the corporation more of a civic citizen. I think there are some corporate leaders who are behind this, and I just think it's an important part of the formula, because, you know, when I try to think of leaders in our society who might get a hearing from everybody, like, there aren't very many. You know, like, conservatives aren't going to take, you know, I don't know, a labor leader seriously, but they might take a corporate leader seriously.
Let's open up for questions. If you'll raise your hand and the mic will come to you, and just stand up and speak into the mic. And I'm sure Mike will take questions about the book or about current events or whatever. I'm sure he's open to anything. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating.
Get real close to that mic. There we go.
I'm very interested in these days of polarization, that acts can be passed with very slim majorities if they got 51%, which very adversely affect the 49%. What do you think? Would it work better if we had consensus, or something similar that was like 80% of the Congress had to agree before anything was enacted? I know the League of Women Voters works that way, and they seem to make it a success. Could government work that way, or would it be just total deadlock?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea. It's a nice idea, but I think it just couldn't possibly work. It's hard enough to get to 51. So, like, one of the problems in the Senate is that it takes 60 votes, as many of you know, to get something passed, because they have this vote called a cloture vote. It's a procedural vote that they have to take before they take the vote on actual passage. And that gives, it's complicated to explain, but that gives 41 people the ability to say no. In a body of 100, it gives 41 people the ability to block something from happening. And so there's a lot of debate these days about whether the filibuster might be eliminated. Now, Senate institutionalists don't want to do it. It's probably more liberals than conservatives who are in favor of it. Although, you know, like, if I were a conservative, I would have been in favor of it 2 or 3 years ago, because, you know, you had a Republican president, a Republican Senate, a Republican House. They could have passed all kinds of stuff. And then, you know, well, it's just up to the Democrats to get your butts elected, and then you go pass your stuff. I think it's more democratic.
Yeah, what he touched on, Michael, but doesn't that get to, in elections, and you have in your book, ranked choice? Explain that, because that's a concept people are talking more about now.
Yeah, that's another proposal that I think is a pretty good idea. And it's basically where if there are 4 people running for Congress or whatever it is, instead of just voting for the one you like, you rank them 1 through 4. And then they do this complicated counting process of eliminating them one by one. The theory behind ranked choice voting is that it might produce somewhat more moderate people, because, you know, if you're not somebody's favorite, because it's an incentive structure for the candidate, okay? Because, like, if I'm running, and maybe I'm not going to be everybody's first choice, obviously, but I do want to be their second choice. I want to have a shot at being their second choice. So I'm not going to probably take as extreme positions, and I'm maybe not going to run as harshly negative a campaign, right? Because if all I'm known for is attacks, I'm not going to be people's second choice. So ranked choice voting is something that is starting to catch on a little bit. They actually do it now in Maine. It's the first state at the congressional level. But I think we're going to be hearing more about that, too.
Next question. I'm sorry, over here. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Hey, let's see. So, Michael, I was just thinking, first of all, congratulations. I know you're going to be doing a lot of appearances all over the country, but nothing is as great as Morgantown, right?
Not even close. I mean, where else would I find the person who babysat me when I was 3 years old?
Exactly. We won't identify him. So we've been having, I was doing the math, and we've been having this conversation that I wanted to ask you about for 15 years. And I feel like it's become even more amplified now and reflects the polarization. So 15 years ago, you and I talked about how it is that we can get the left and liberals and Democrats to align more with progressive Muslims. And it feels like the direction has actually gone even more extreme than we talked about 15 years ago, with the Democratic Party now aligning with the more theologically conservative Muslims that, for example, are very anti-Israel, a platform of the Democratic Party. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think this has happened, and does it trouble you at all? And what do you think can be done to help bring Democrats more to the center?
Yeah, it troubles me some, it does. How has it happened? Well, it's happened because, identity politics is just sort of a very powerful force on the left these days. And I think, liberalism, which should be, to some extent still is, but definitely used to be, rooted in more universal kind of Enlightenment values, if that's not too highfalutin a way to talk, has lost a little bit of that. And I've written about that. I've been writing about that for a long time. I've been, I'm liberal, but I'm a critic of liberalism too. And I wrote the book he referenced, Left for Dead, was basically a critique of all that 20 years ago. So I've been there, and on the one hand, I understand why people from groups that have not had political power, step up and insist on having their power, and rightly so, and having their share of power, rightly so. I hate to see old liberal values thrown out the window in the course of that, which does happen sometimes. I think that Democrats are in danger now of imitating the Republicans a bit and drifting out to the left, and we'll see what happens in the 2020 election. That candidate is not my candidate. I want to say, for the record, in case anybody's curious. I still think they have a long way to go to get to that point, and I don't think he's going to be the nominee. But it's a touchy moment these next few years for the Democrats.
Next question. Yes, ma'am. Hang on a second. Let's get the microphone over here. No, we
No.
want to get it on mic because we're recording it. So thank you. Go ahead.
What about the Electoral College?
Yeah, I think the Electoral College should follow the popular vote. It wasn't devised for a very good reason, and this is another thing they fought about a lot at the Constitutional Convention. They had a bunch of different proposals, and they weren't quite sure what to do. And they originally envisioned the electors. Now the electors just rubber stamp what the voters did, but they envisioned the electors as just doing what they wanted. And if the people voted the wrong way, the electors would say, well, no, actually, you meant for this person to be president. So, they meant for the people to have even far less power than they have. But, I think there's something wrong with the system where, in 2 of the last 5 elections, the candidate who got fewer popular votes becomes the president. And it wasn't conceived for good reasons, and I don't think there are particularly good reasons to keep it.
Do you think states like West Virginia and Wyoming and the Dakotas would then be completely overlooked if that were the case?
Well, they're overlooked now, aren't they? I mean, they are. I mean, candidates only campaign in 5 states, really, or 7, and they'd probably still basically campaign most of the time in those states. Although Although, and here's where it gets interesting. So, like, if I'm a Republican candidate for president and it's popular vote, I have to think about California and New York, right? I can't lose them 65 to 35 because that's a lot of popular votes. I want to try to get 45 in California. Same thing if I'm a Democrat. I can't lose Texas, by a huge margin. I got to try to come close. Maybe that pulls both candidates a little bit toward the middle somehow.
Right here? Okay. Yeah, Russ.
You had mentioned one of your topics was single-member districts. Let me follow with one that applies to West Virginia. West Virginia legislature last year passed a bill which would do away with multiple member districts in favor of single member districts.
Yeah.
That's following a long trend of other states having moved in that direction, supported by some at least, the feeling that it's more equitable in that regard, particularly as it protects civil rights and the Voters Act at all. Yeah. I trust you think West Virginia is headed in the wrong direction, and I know you came up with a bit of a hybrid system as well. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, well, I don't. State legislatures, it's different. My main concern really is Congress because, Congress is like where the problem is. I think at the national level, it kind of makes sense to try and move in the other direction, and the reason is the aggressive gerrymandering of the single-member districts. You all know this story, and these districts can be drawn in such a way that if you're a Republican, you don't have to go get a single independent or Democratic vote. And if you're a Democrat, you don't have to go get a single independent or Republican vote. A lot of people think, there are experts who look at this, think that multi-member districts might alleviate that a little bit and might make people who are running in larger multi-member districts have to have a somewhat broader appeal. It's kind of complicated. It's all spelled out in the book. I don't think I need to go into too much detail, but there's one proposal in Congress by a Democratic congressman from Northern Virginia that I think is really worth looking at, and I talk about it a little bit in the book.
If Congress can't agree on anything, how would they agree on changing anything?
No, I mean, no, they won't. That's quite a catch-22.
Back here, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in your thoughts on ranked choice voting. I think that's one of the most important things we could possibly do. I mean, you mentioned for the candidates, but also for the fact that it eliminates spoiler candidates, that people don't feel like they have to throw, the notion of throwing away your vote is just gone. So we don't end up with two terrible candidates like we did very recently, in my opinion. So, and it also affects that gerrymandering that you were talking about. So, but we also see at the same time that Democrats and Republicans are both making moves to eliminate third parties from debates and other things like this. So I feel like maybe the two parties, do you agree that maybe the two parties will be an obstacle to ranked choice voting? And if so, how do you think we can overcome that? Because they'll be losing these sort of gerrymandered districts and these sort of like easy wins. Do you know what I mean? So they'll be allowing in third parties. Do you feel like that Democrats and Republicans will oppose this? And if so, what do you think can be done about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, in most of these cases, like there's a party in a particular state, and these things will all be done by the states. That's what the Constitution says. It's up to the states to determine how they conduct their elections. And in most states, it's going to be pretty clear to people, that one party is going to benefit and that one party is not going to benefit. And so the party that's going to benefit will probably be for it, and the party that's not going to benefit will probably be against it. I mean, I think but more generally than that, like any kind of electoral reform that you're talking about is going to be very, very difficult to get through, and there will be bipartisan opposition because what they think of first is my job, my seat. How's this going to affect me? How's this going to change my district? If there's one thing members of Congress know, it's their districts. It's their districts. They know them down to the census tract, believe me. And they know that if they cast such and such a vote, they're going to lose 800 votes here and 3,000 votes here and this and that. They know that stuff cold. And, you know, their first reaction to any big proposed change is going to be, how's this going to affect me? Am I going to get reelected under this system? And it's going to be hard to get things through. They're not going to just wake up one day and decide, you know, to do it because they're nice people.
Yes, sir.
Could this possibly be just a sign of the decline of the American empire?
Well, yeah. Yeah, well.
Prominent social scientists are saying that we are in a decline. And it isn't necessarily starting with Trump.
No.
It started years ago.
No, it's not starting with Trump. I mean, you know, I wrote a piece in the New York Times today that kind of touches on this. And I would just take issue with the word empire. I mean, that's like, you know, we don't, yeah. Well, ascendancy, okay? We were designed as a democratic republic. And those words mean two different things. Democracy means rule of the people. Republic means you're a nation of laws. We were designed as a democratic republic. We weren't a very good one, to be honest. You know, I mean, there were enslaved people. There was unequal representation. There was a lot of, you know, messy, bad stuff. We worked on it over the years. We finally got to a point where I think, you know, we had a pretty good system. And I feel that we've been chipping away at that. And not just me. I mean, loads of people feel that we've been chipping away at that and that we've been losing our moral authority. And you know, I mean, you can look around and see that people feel it. I mean, why is socialism so popular among young people? You know, I'm not a fan of socialism, but, you know, I understand. I mean, if you were born in 2000, the capitalism that you've seen has worked really well for 12 or 15% of the people and hasn't worked that well for a lot of people. So, you know, I understand them thinking that way. And that's what we have to do something about.
How much do you think the media and the way media cover politics have contributed to the polarization?
Well, a lot. And yeah, I think everybody knows this story, that, you know,
One, two, one.
That's okay. Yep. In the old days, there was Walter Cronkite, and, you know, he gave the news, and everybody trusted him, and John Chancellor a little bit. And now, it's just not like that. There's no Walter Cronkite, and there's never going to be any Walter Cronkite again. And, you know, the people who believe Fox, and the people who believe the others. And completely different set of facts. I mean, you know, if you're an MSNBC watcher, go watch Fox for 10 minutes every night. You won't believe what you see. And vice versa. You just won't believe what you see. And so, yeah, I mean, if there's not an agreed upon set of facts, you know, I don't know what we do about that.
More questions? Here we go. Hang on a second. She'll bring the microphone to you. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks. It's interesting about the institutions that we've discussed. The institutions we've discussed here. We've talked about the way our economy is organized. We've talked about the way our political system is organized. But there's one system that we haven't mentioned, although Michael has said some things that make me think he's concerned about it, and that is education. This is one institution that is everywhere in this country. And yet we have an inequality of education that is worse than income inequality, and far more important in the kind of people we are becoming. And the people that you are saying we are becoming are centered much more upon our individual welfare rather than our community welfare. And if education is as unequal as it is, for example, some people say it's your zip code that makes the difference in whether or not you're going to have the education required for a complex society such as ours. Why do we pay so little attention then nationally to education, which education is really the poor relative of national policy? Now, I know that is supposed to be is the area of each state, right? So we say that if you have a choice of where you want to go to live the rest of your life, the thing to do is to find out where the best schools are. And I did an informal survey in my beauty parlor, and I asked different women around the place, if you move somewhere and you go to a realtor, what is the one question that you will ask this realtor? These were all different women, different ages, and so on. And every one of them agreed, where are the best schools?
Well, Michael, why don't you speak to that?
Yeah, well, inequality in education is, as you know, largely a function of geography and a function of property taxes. And there are movements in some places. There are movements to change that distribution and change the formula, and they just don't get far. They don't get much of anywhere because the people who pay more property taxes, who have the better schools, also have more political power, and they don't want to go sending their money, even though they might be like liberal and vote Democratic. When it comes to their kids, things are different. It's very hard to get around that problem. I don't have much of an expertise on education. My main wish for education is just that it inculcated more citizenship into kids. And that you can do in, Montgomery County, where I live, a relatively wealthy school district, or Morgantown, or, East Los Angeles. I mean, you can do that anywhere. I do think we need to pay teachers a lot more than we do, and that was a lesson that you saw firsthand in this state. And there's some movement about that. I mean, even Oklahoma, you talk about taxes, Oklahoma raised taxes, Oklahoma, to increase teachers' pay. So there's a little ray of hope there, but, I don't know, it's a deep, thorny problem.
Let's take just one or two more questions, then I'm sure Michael will stick around and talk to him, or are we good? Are we good? One more, and then we'll, Michael, visit with you afterward. Yes, sir.
Michael, one thing you haven't mentioned at all that seems to influence a lot of things you're talking about is money in politics. Citizens United, Koch brothers. I mean, it's enormous. The literally hundreds of millions of dollars spent in the last presidential election. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it just keeps getting worse and worse. And the cost of a congressional election today is about twice what it was 20 years ago. That's factoring in inflation. And, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. This can't be the last question because my answer to this question is like way too depressing for us to end on. So we have to think of something else to close on. And if you want to ask me questions like about 2020 and stuff, feel free. It doesn't have to all be about the book. So 1976 was the big decision, Buckley v. Vallejo. And in that decision, the Supreme Court said that spending is the same thing as free speech, which I don't know, seems kind of crazy to me. I mean, we all have the same amount of speech. We don't all have the same amount of money, but it's what they said. And so that means that candidates can spend as much as they want. But they did keep limits on contributions in that 1976 decision, so that the maximum contributions that you can give now are $2,300 per election. Now, this is where this gets depressing. What I think this Supreme Court is going to do is erase those contribution limits at the earliest possible, whenever they find a case that they can do it. So, so then, a billionaire can buy as many members of Congress as he wants.
Michael, let's...
wait, Dave.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, over here? Yes, sir. All right, hang on. Wait till the mic comes over there.
Michael, I just want to know if you're taller than George Stephanopoulos.
You are? Yeah, I think you are.
Should I say, really? I mean,
He's a short guy. Michael, you were...
He looms large in all our lives, I'm sure.
Michael was born and raised, of course, in Morgantown, and he said, when we were getting directions over here, Michael said, oh, you turned by the communications building, which, of course, was torn down about 10 years ago. So, Michael, when you were in college here, they might be here now, they might not. What were your 2 or 3 favorite night haunts? Where did you hang out back in the day? And are they still there?
Gang? Well, I played in a band.
Right. Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Which some of these folks know. There's one of my bandmates right there. Yep. Ziegfeld's we used to play. That was my favorite place to play. That was that big Victorian house across from Morgantown Junior High School, to name another landmark that's not there. The Red Cellar on Wednesday nights. Do I hear any cheers for that one? Yeah, that we liked. Dr. John's.
Yeah.
Sunnyside. Don't remind me. But anyhow, there were a lot more than that. I spent a lot more time in those places than I did in the library, I must admit. But, so listen, so can I say a quick public service announcement? Okay, so now's the time when you prove to those, well, let me tell it like this. So my publisher sent me to New York and Boston and Philadelphia. And I said, aren't you going to send me anywhere that's like not 15 miles from the coast? Aren't you going to send me anywhere like in the middle of the country? Nah, we don't really have the budget for that. We don't experience good results. So I've gone to Detroit on my own dime. I've gone to Detroit and Columbus, and I've sold a lot of books in both those places, more than I sold in New York. So this, folks, is your opportunity to teach those snoots in New York that people in West Virginia buy books, okay? Yes, and read them. So thanks a lot. It's great to see you all.
No, they changed.
You'll stick around, talk to folks?